Hi, everybody. Happy Monday. It is August 15th, 2022, and we are marking 1 year since the Taliban took over Afghanistan. And we're going to be doing this in a unique way. Exactly 1 year ago today, almost at exactly the same time, we were doing an Instagram Live together with a journalist who was based in Afghanistan at that time, and her name is Hollie McKay. Hollie and I had just met only days earlier over Zoom. We had only just become more familiar with the work that we were doing. And I was so impressed by her ability to report inside Afghanistan during such a critical time in history. We knew this was an important time going into August of 2021. We knew that it was going to be history making because we knew on the horizon was America's withdrawal from Afghanistan. We just didn't know the specifics of it. We didn't know when, exactly how it was going to take place, what to know about it. And so there was some unknown. At the same time, we were also hearing that the Taliban was gaining more ground and had controlled more ground, more territory in the country than at any point in the war. And so these two storylines were sort of going to be intersecting. And then something rather unexpected happened on August 15th. There will be those that will tell you that there was a high probability of the Taliban taking over the country once the United States withdrew. But very few had talked about the Taliban taking over the country while the United States was still present. And that's something to remind ourselves of today. So August 15th, 2021, the major cities, the major districts in the country fall to Taliban control, but specifically and strategically, this happens in Kabul, the capital city. And that was kind of the holdout. Well, Kabul will stand, but Kabul didn't stand. And so that's why August 15th is known as that date where the Taliban take over. We know that the full U.S. withdrawal doesn't happen for a couple weeks. And so our focus today is really going to be talking about Afghanistan as it is now and reflecting a little bit on that time period, that critical time period with Hollie, who's going to join us in just a moment. Before we get to that, I just want to set the stage. You know, when we say Afghanistan, we all know Afghanistan. It's been in the news for the better part of 2 decades. But let's just talk a little bit about the country just for a moment. Afghanistan is a nation of about just under 40 million people, so about the population of California. It is a landlocked country, borders some really important countries like Pakistan, for example. It is one of, I thought this was interesting, I read this today in the encyclopedia. When you're looking for research, you just got to go old fashioned, go back to the encyclopedia, right? That Afghanistan is one of the poorest surveyed countries in the world. So there's a lot of parts in Afghanistan that remain more mysterious to those on the outside about what does the land actually look like there? What do we need to know about it? I wanted to show you this. I thought this was an interesting map. Let me go ahead and pull it up because we asked, well, how big is Afghanistan? Here's the state of Texas. This was done by Texas Monthly. Superimpose the state of Texas. This is so Texan, by the way. Superimpose the state of Texas over Afghanistan so we can see that in many ways it's comparable in size to the state of Texas. So just gives us a little bit of an idea, again, of a country that we've talked a lot about, but maybe still don't know some of the more basic facts to it. Before I bring Hollie in, and I'm going to do that in a second, I want to show you the map. So last year when we were speaking to Hollie, she was in the city of Mazar-i-Sharif at the top kind of northern part of the country. This is a really critical city, not only because it's a big city, but when we're looking, if we go back to 2001, when the Taliban were actually pushed out of Afghanistan by U.S. forces in the aftermath of 9/11, Mazar falling away from Taliban control was kind of a key canary in the coal mine of that the country, the Taliban are not going to control the country. So the Taliban coming back into a place like Mazar is also significant. So I wanted to point that out to you. One of the other things I was doing this morning was looking over the Special Inspector General report for Afghanistan Reconstruction. This was mentioned in a Washington Post piece today. This was actually published August of 2021. Again, not knowing exactly what that month would bring, and that includes more U.S. soldiers who were killed in action in service to our country in Afghanistan. So some of these numbers don't likely include those or Afghans that were also injured and killed. Just a review of the 20-year war in Afghanistan. More than 2,400 American troops were killed, more than 1,100 Allied troops, more than 20,000 U.S. troops injured, And then on the Afghan side, we have 66,000 Afghan troops killed, 66,000, 48,000 civilians killed, 75,000 injured. And as the report mentions, that's likely a vast underestimation of some of those numbers. Right now, we're looking at Afghanistan. Some of the big storylines, of course, remain the Taliban leadership, the collapsed economy, the humanitarian crisis that's taking place, and the status of life. Why were we in Afghanistan to begin with? Because it was a safe haven for terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda. And we saw the effects of that on 9/11 here in the United States. So with that, let's go ahead and see if we can bring in Hollie. Talk to us a little bit about what this day is like for her. There's a lot of different news items I'm seeing on Afghanistan, and I'm not quite sure what to make of it all, because some of them, maybe I thought there would be more coverage. I always think there's going to be more coverage of foreign policy. And then there's not. So I'm sort of not sure what to make of the coverage so far, which makes me even more excited to talk to you, Hollie. Hollie, it's great to see you.
Thank you for having me, Jenna. It's always a pleasure.
Can you believe it, that it's been a year?
I know, a crazy, crazy year. In many ways, it feels like a long time, and then in other ways, it feels very short. So it's, yeah, it's very surreal looking back.
Can you take us back, if you could? I reposted some of our interview from last year, which remains one of my favorite interviews, just because I just love speaking to you, and I thought you provided such incredible insight. But just to give some of those that may be new to your story, tell us a little bit about why you were in Afghanistan in August last year, and what sort of situation you found yourself in on August 15th.
So I was in Afghanistan. It's a place I'd worked over the years previously, and a good friend of mine and a brilliant war photographer, also Australian, Jake Simkin, and I decided that we wanted to sort of go and do a book that would really document that sort of last little period of the US being there, and then what would happen next, which was very precarious, but at the same time, I don't think either of us expected the country to fall so quickly. But so we went back in the beginning of August, and we were in Kabul. And then under the invitation of Marshal Dostum, we went to the north. Now, Dostum is somebody that I knew, that I'd previously visited with in Ankara. He is if you've seen the movie, I think it's 12 Strong, he's sort of the sort of central character in that, and played a very central role after 9/11 when the United States entered Afghanistan through Mazar, and sort of that was the first place the Taliban were ousted from. So I went to Mazar that week, really was told that there was no way that Dostum was going to leave, or Dostum's fighters were going to leave, and that despite the fact that much of that northern area had already fallen to the Taliban, so I was aware of the danger. It was sort of presented to me by intelligence, by different factions, under a very different light. And that sort of goes to show you the unexpected nature, I guess, of the Taliban coming in so quickly. So we went to Mazar at the end of that week, and it's an incredible city. It's very vibrant, and as we arrived, it had that vibrancy that I always remembered about it. The markets were full, there was music, people were dancing. It was just a very lively place, but I remember thinking how bizarre it was that there was no police on the street. There was, no military presence. I remember thinking how strange that was, because this was a place that was, everywhere around it was falling. And how is it that this place was so close to falling, or had so much danger around it, and yet there was just no military or police presence? And I remember thinking that was incredibly bizarre. But as sort of the day went on, everything was normal on that Thursday. Friday came, which is the weekend day, the only weekend day in Afghanistan. And obviously things got a little bit quieter, but you certainly found this sort of cynicism that was creeping in. And when I would interview people in the street, it seemed that they knew more about things than the officials did, because they were sort of like, it's going to fall, there's nothing we can do. And people had fled from Kunduz and all these other neighboring provinces to Mazar, and then people from Mazar were fleeing to Kabul, thinking that was the only safe haven. So things got very strange, and I think that Friday night I went out with a lot of the commandos, and even they were sort of very very patriotic, and were insisting that they weren't going to ever give up their city. But something didn't feel right, and when I woke up the next day, Saturday, I remember, I think we talked that night, Jenna. And then I woke up the next day and I just remember I was a mess. And it was one of those funny situations looking back on it where you sort of think your body almost knows things better than your mind does in times. And I just remember I was this sort of mess and I couldn't really figure out why. That day went on, we couldn't get hold of any interpreters because everybody had fled. And finally, someone put us in touch with someone, and a guy that we didn't know previously came to the hotel and said he would work for us that day. We kind of walked around. It was very bizarre. You saw big lines outside the bank where people were just getting all their money and trying to flee to Kabul. And then by lunchtime, you started to see people in these little rickshaws coming in from the outer villages that were fleeing into the city. And that was sort of very symbolic to me that those places were either fallen or very close to fallen. And I remember we were in a cab and we're driving and toward the front lines, and I just remember the cab sort of turned around and he was like, I'm just so scared. And we just said, oh, it's okay, we'll go back. I don't want you to be scared. And our interpreter was on his little flip phone, and he turned around, he had this big smile on his face, which was a little bizarre. And there was 3 sort of front lines, and he just looked and said, the first one's fallen. And it just, it was one of those feelings. There was not much we could do because we had a commercial flight booked back to Kabul on that Monday. There was no way you could get anywhere else on the road. And I remember making a lot of calls that afternoon again to Afghan officials, and even they were sort of persisting at that point. And mind you, this was 2 hours before it fell, that it wasn't going to fall and that we'd be okay. It should hold for 48 hours. And that night, Jake and I went out to our normal kebab place that we would always go to, and there was barely a soul in the street. And we get to this place, and it was sort of down in a basement, and it was open, and a lot of places weren't open. So surprisingly, it was open, but the TVs were all pulled out of the wall, and there was just absolutely no sound. And I just remember we sort of looked at each other, and we just said, something's not right. And we're like, we need to go back to our hotel. And so we sort of hurried back. And as we hurried back, you just sort of saw these motorcycles come in, shooting in the air as sort of a celebration. And that was the Taliban taking over. And there really was no fight. There was no pushback. We were sort of trying to figure out exactly, had it fallen, hadn't it fallen? And we were at the roof of the hotel, which was the tallest building in Mazar. And, I think I was on the phone to my old fixer, who was in London at the time. He's like, yeah, unfortunately it's fallen. And I was like, what do you mean? And he's like, yeah, Mazar just fell. And I think the first call I got was Greg Murray at NPR. Are you still there? And I just thought, oh my gosh, yes, I'm still here. And I don't know how I'm going to get out. So it was just an unknown situation because we didn't really know at that point how the Taliban was going to treat a journalist, a foreigner, a woman. So there was just a huge amount of unknowns, and it was a very unfamiliar sort of situation to kind of be in, knowing that really it was only Jake and I that were there, and we couldn't even get back to Kabul. And then Kabul fell the next day, and so that's when we sort of really realized no one was coming to help, and we needed to figure this out on our own.
Was it very clear? I'm always curious about this part of the story, that the Taliban came into the city on motorcycles. That's just not how I would, in the movie, I wouldn't imagine that. And I'm just curious, was that very clear? Like when you saw these guys on motorcycles, did they distinguish themselves as Taliban? Was there?
Not necessarily, but there was a different, I mean, Taliban, everyone in Afghanistan has Afghan dress, but there was something different about it. It's hard for me to describe. There was a difference. They were bearded. They, had it was just a very different sort of, almost a confidence that sort of came in, and you could tell that these people were, again, the shooting in the air, the sort of the celebratory nature of it. You could tell that these people were not Afghans, fighting to keep their city.
What were the next few days like for you?
I just remember it being incredibly bizarre and thinking really how that night was a big celebratory night. So all night you had, gunshots going off, you had the nasheed. So the Taliban bans music, but they played the nasheed, which is a religious songs that don't have any instruments. So you had that sort of blaring from like every mosque speaker, and it was a lot of activity. We'd be looking out the window, and there was certainly sort of this sort of massive celebration that was happening. And then I just remember sort of thinking, and I'd been on the phone to different people that I knew that night trying to think, and I said, if we don't get out before daylight, then you can't get out during the day. They're going to find out. So daylight came and went. The Taliban, slept through. I think that their celebrations went to about 3 a.m. and then it was dead quiet. And you woke up and you would hear the call to prayer at the beginning of daylight. And it was completely different. And I looked out, and I remember those few days and looking out on the street, and you barely saw a woman. It took several days before I even saw a woman again, and she was always covered. But you would just sort of see these just giant packs of men that you sort of hadn't seen before. And it felt very much like we'd be plunged into this medieval time. And then they would blare messages through the speakers, talking about, it was in Pashto, and it was sort of talking about reporting any Taliban that did anything wrong to this particular phone place. And it was this very different sense that I'd never seen before. And I was always remember being very grateful to the workers in our hotel, because they were really terrified. A lot of them had worked for NDS, which is the intelligence group in Afghanistan, the government group. And yet they were so, they stayed there for us, even though everyone basically cleared out of the hotel except for us. And I believe there was a couple of other foreigners. I think one was from Turkey and another was from Tajikistan, perhaps. But even they sort of left after a few days. But you had these very young guys, and they were just, whatever they had in the kitchen, they would bring to us. And I remember the night that it fell, being upstairs on the roof, sort of trying to figure it out, and they would come up with, tea and nuts and sweets. And at one point, one of them got me on the phone to the guy who owned the hotel, who wasn't. I don't know that he was in the country, but he was the owner, and he said, "Look, don't worry. I've talked to the Taliban. They promised that they're not going to enter the hotel." And I thought, that was such a relief to me at that point, even though I didn't know if it was true, but it was such a relief that, that he'd had some sort of dialogue and that they promised to leave us alone. But then the next morning, Jake had gone downstairs, and the guards who immediately, they used to have like the camo uniforms, and immediately they got changed into their civilian dress, their Afghan dress. They got rid of their weapons just to not cause any problems. But I remember him telling me there was a bank underneath the hotel, and that the Taliban had been spent all night trying to get into the hotel. And I just remember thinking, oh gosh, this is not what I need to hear right now. So that was certainly a little bit. I remember there was these sort of bomb-proof doors on our level, and Jake went around and was locking them all, so we were sort of cushioned in a little bit. But it was a lot of unknown. It was very, very precarious, sort of, and I remember, bless people's heart, but so my name would end up in these different WhatsApp group chats, and literally my phone would not stop. You had all these people that were, obviously well-meaning, but everybody was trying to be the savior of the day, to the point where I was like, how are you going to save me? You've been military for 10 years. I don't know why you keep calling me, sort of thing. And so I had 1,000,001 people from every possible wherever just calling me, and that was a bit stressful, because I was like, I don't know why you keep asking me for my details when I've already given it to X amount of people. Like, I can't keep doing this. So we had to weed through a lot of the RAF and figure out who was genuinely in a position to be of use, and who was just kind of wanting to be in on the action.
I just want to point out to our audience that I was one of those people on her WhatsApp. I was like, Hollie, are you okay now? Are you okay now? Hollie, are you okay now? Hollie, are you? And we had just met for the first time, Hollie, and I found myself, I was up all night. I mean, I was, for the several days, just like thinking about you, writing you. During this time, Hollie continues her reporting, by the way, not just for Smarter News, but for international media outlets all over the world. She's keeping up with things, and she's trying to navigate herself out of the country, because clearly that's what the next step had to be. Although I know you quickly came back in, which we'll get to. But just to also set a little groundwork here, I mean, Hollie's been in a lot of interesting situations. I say interesting because I'm just gonna just broadly. I mean, you interviewed ISIS terrorists in Syria. You've been to Iraq. You've been to Yemen. You've been to Iran. You've been a lot of places, a lot of different conflict zones. And so you said something at the beginning of the interview that your body sort of knows something before you can. And the whole time, Hollie was very calm. You know, yes, this is what I'm going to try to do, and this is what we're trying next, and this is what we're going to do. But did you, now looking back, is there a level of fear that you feel for yourself at that time that's different than what you experienced? Just thinking back on what that stressful situation and was like, and all the unknown that was around you.
I think I was very much of the mind, and I'm still of the mind of, I chose to be there. That was a decision I made. I'm very aware of the dangers that can happen in any places, and unlike a lot of the people that didn't have that choice that I had to be there or not to be there. I always sort of, I guess, took responsibility for the fact that I had chosen to be there, and I felt that it was important to be there. And I think even in the middle of the sort of madness of it, I didn't have any point of regret or wishing that I hadn't gone, because again, it was something I felt strongly about, and that was a decision that I had made, and I had to own it.
There you go. How'd you get out?
So several days, several different whatever later. So right in the beginning, I said to a contact that I was speaking with in the State Department in Kabul, I said, you guys have been talking to the Taliban in the Doha office for months. I said, what is the problem with talking to the Taliban? And to his credit, he said, okay, sort of like didn't try to, I thought he might like say, don't do that, that's not safe. But he didn't. And Mazar is right in the north of the country. So at that point, it really wasn't going to be a possibility to get back to Kabul. The only real way out was Uzbekistan, but the border was closed. So that was a problem. And somebody, an incredible US diplomat in the embassy in Tashkent, which is the capital of Uzbekistan, they were able to be of assistance in having that border open. But the problem was, we had to leave the hotel, and days had been going on. So, and I needed to leave purely for the workers, if anything.
How much is the distance, Hollie, between the city and how far you would have to drive to get to the border?
I'm not quite sure of the mileage, but it's around about an hour drive.
Okay.
So close. And that just seemed, the most sensible route. And again, because we didn't have, again, I would have done things differently looking back, but anyway, this is the scenario. So in the end, we just said, well, we're going to talk to the Taliban. And so we were able to facilitate somebody who worked for a big company that had already had dealings with the Taliban in Mazar. And they just sort of said, be ready at midday. This was about 11:30 a.m. one morning. And they said, be ready at midday, have all your stuff. So, we're frantically trying to get our stuff together, ditching the body armor and ditching all the things that we didn't need. And we go downstairs to the hotel, and they're like, come to the basement with all your stuff. So we, at this point, I think Jake and I were like, whatever, we're just going to go for this, because there's not a huge amount of options right now. And the Taliban, these two elders had come, and we got into their car, again, not knowing what was going on.
Is there an interpreter with you? I mean, do you know?
There was one guy with us who could speak, and he was in a separate car, and he could speak, he was sort of acted as a translator. He was the sort of the business person that helped us facilitate that. And he said, look, we're going to go to the Uzbek consulate, and it's closed. They talked to the Americans, and they're willing to, have the border open, but there's some things you have to go through. And we get into the car, and the Taliban, these elders, just sort of looked at us and said, welcome. It was very bizarre. And then, of course, me being a journalist in the car with these Taliban, said, well, can I interview you? And they said, sure. So, here I am trying to throw a million questions at them in this car ride, and then we get dropped off. And we're at the Uzbek consulate for a little while where they're sorting some things out. And then, they said, well, the Taliban is going to escort you to the border to Uzbekistan. And so, that was the afternoon. We ended up with this sort of then a bunch of young Taliban that sort of came, and they escorted us over what they call the Friendship Bridge, and they had the border sort of especially open for us, which we were very fortunate because it had been shut. And I think, Jake and I had sort of discussed it, and because we'd had those dealings with the Taliban, we decided that, we were still very committed to the story, and, we needed to regroup and things like getting money out and all that sort of things, because there was no longer access to ATMs or cash in Afghanistan. So we had to sort of sort out a few of, the survival protocols, if you will. And once we'd sort of done that, we were fairly confident in our decision. We had made contact with some media Taliban people that were facilitating the media in Kabul, and they said that we were welcome to go back. And that was a decision that I felt very strongly that we needed to do, because pretty much all the American journalists at that point, barring a few, had left the country. And I thought this is such a critical time to be there. And at that point, I made that decision much to the ire, I'm sure, of a lot of people who helped sort of facilitate us getting out. But I felt that it was very important to do that. And so we arranged a driver to sort of pick us up again from that border, and once it had reopened, and we crossed back. I think, that was a 12-hour journey through Taliban land back to Kabul, and that's where I spent the next 4 months.
Right, all the way until December. And so just to put a fine point on that, so Hollie crosses the border, spends some time outside of Afghanistan, and then I remember the moment when she said, "Oh, I think I'm going to go back." And I thought, you're going back now? Maybe just wait maybe a couple days. Why don't you rest? That's, that was the mother in me, like, really, Hollie? I mean, did you feel a sense of relief when you crossed the border? Just going back to that moment, you finally crossed the border into Uzbekistan. Did you feel like a weight was lifted off your shoulder, or was that an immediate feeling of, oh no, I actually think we need to go back? Was it kind of immediate?
Yeah, I think it was immediate. I think Jake and I both had this sort of sense of knowing we needed to leave, because logistically we couldn't really stay there, and we didn't have the contacts in Mazar that we had in Kabul. But there was a sense of like, I'm not done with this story. And I think when you are a conflict reporter, I felt as though I was abandoning the story, and that just couldn't sleep. It was giving me such, there was certainly no relief. I think I had more anxiety being out of the country than in it, just knowing and feeling that I really should be there, and this was what my job was. And again, I'd made a decision to come to Afghanistan to cover this story, and the story wasn't over. And so I think, the relief, any relief, was very short-lived, because
was there a moment when you were leaving, again, going back to that period where you're getting in the van with these people that you don't know, going a place that maybe you could be going or maybe not, you could be kidnapped, we have no idea. Was there ever a moment during that particular day where you thought, wow, that was a real close call? Like that was actually pretty dicey? Or for most
of the drive?
Yes, the drive. Well, no, the drive out and then the drive back in. I'm just, because one of the unique parts of your reporting was your direct interaction with the Taliban, which very few people had at that time. And the way that they were treating you, trying to set a tone for the country, was almost immediate based on my, recall of your reporting. And so as a journalist, I mean, you are following your instincts of, okay, this actually feels okay. I maybe not trust these people, but I don't feel threatened. Did you ever feel threatened at any point? We can go leaving Afghanistan or then coming back into Kabul, where you're like, I don't know. That was close.
I didn't, to be quite honest with you. That moment, again, there's all the unknowns, and in that moment, I remember sort of getting into the back of this little Toyota Corolla, and it's sort of the Taliban turning around and just sort of saying welcome. And at that point, I felt as though, I fit into their code of Pashtun-Wali, which was that they very much treated me like a guest in their country. And so I felt at that point that I didn't, again, we could always, there's always a bunch of unknowns, but I think at that point I was so focused on trying to talk to them and understand what they were thinking, how the vision of the country and what their interpretation of Sharia and all these things were. I don't think that I didn't have time to feel that sense of threat. You have to very much compartmentalize and focus on what you're doing, and I didn't have time to sort of feel that concern. And that's again what sort of factored into the reason why I felt comfortable enough in pretty much turning around and coming back, was that I didn't feel that sense of being threatened. I think it certainly helped that Jake and I were Australian and had Australian accents. So I think that, is a certain degree of buffer too, because even though obviously Australia is complete lockstep with the US in the conflict there, I just, in the mind of the Taliban, it's different. So I didn't feel a huge sort of threat once I'd broken the ice and had that sort of interaction. I think a lot of the times what happens is we end up conflating a lot of these jihadist groups and in the minds of a lot of the media and things that were coming from outside were very much like the Taliban is ISIS. And it's important to acknowledge, while they obviously do have some degree of similarities there, they are very different groups. And I think that was sort of very immediately apparent to me that they had the way that they were going to treat me as opposed to a group like the Daesh.
Mm-hmm. And Daesh being ISIS. What did you find? Just bring me to the timeline. When did you finally get back to Kabul? Do you remember what date that was?
I believe so. I think sort of Jake and I were doing some other work in Tashkent and in Dushanbe in Tajikistan for a little bit. So I want to say we sort of made the decision to wait out the chaos that was happening with the US withdrawal. So I think we sort of arrived back the day after. So I believe it was the 31st of August or 1st of September. Okay. It didn't seem conducive to kind of enter into that fray, and what we were really committed to was the aftermath of that. So we went back in that.
So over the course of the next several months, up until really early mid-December, Hollie's reporting in Afghanistan. She did a series of reports for us at Smarter News, and we kept up with her on her many different adventures and experiences. And actually, we have a really special interview for you. Just want to flag for everybody on this live and watching later, where Hollie's going to review some of these experiences with someone that she worked with, lockstep, speaking of lockstep, in Afghanistan, which is her fixer, which is, we'll explain more during the interview, as someone that's really you work very, very closely with. So I don't want to give too much away, because it's very cool to see you speak with someone who is now still in Afghanistan, and the experiences, the many adventures that you had together, which were overwhelming and fascinating. And so, if you could, Hollie, life under Taliban rule, let's just talk about that briefly here. What did you find in your reporting over those next few months?
Well, at first it was so bizarre, Jenna, because it was this incredible openness that we'd never experienced in Afghanistan because of the security situation. So I remember, we could walk sort of straight up to, once we got this sort of permission letter from the Taliban, from Mujahid's office, and I remember going in, lining up to get this permission letter to say that we were working press, and there was this man, and he was just super friendly and just every sort of antithesis of what you expect a Taliban to be. And so we get this letter, and suddenly it's this sort of crazy openness that you can just freely kind of walk into these ministries, and for me as a woman, they sort of didn't acknowledge me whatsoever, so therefore, I wasn't security checked. It was very strange. And I mean, we'll talk more about this in video, but with things like walking up to a school that was a suicide bombing school and knocking on the door and saying, "Hi, please, can I come in?" and then letting me come in and sit with them. It just very bizarre things that would never have happened. And also with that, you had suddenly the entire country that was to you. So previously, I mean, you couldn't really, you could fly to a few cities, but it was very difficult to get to a lot of places. You couldn't travel by road. It was incredibly dangerous. But now it's sort of like, because sort of that conflict portion had ended, suddenly, you could make these epic road trips from Kabul to Kandahar, or drive freely to Jalalabad or Herat or wherever it may be. So, that's something we really wanted to take advantage of, was being able to see all these pockets of the country that I'd never seen before. And so that, I would say sort of September was this incredibly free, kind of strangely accessible place. And then I think really after those first few weeks, that's when you started to see big crackdowns, and suddenly the letters that you had that you would wave at a checkpoint were no longer acceptable. There was a lot more restriction. It was a lot more difficult to get the interviews, and that sort of crackdown, I think, has just only really increased since then. But beginning, it was incredible, and yeah, the censoring, I think, happened fairly quickly.
What are you hearing from your friends and your contacts who are still living and working in Afghanistan?
It really is a mixed bag. I think there's certainly the big focus certainly is obviously on women's education, which girls have not been able to go to school now for a year, which is deeply problematic in most provinces. The humanitarian situation, 90% of the population having trouble being able to afford or access food. So really that sort of is the focus now, the humanitarian and economic crisis as opposed to the security crisis. So you could certainly argue with that, that despite the very, very heavy thumb of the Taliban, that to a degree the security situation has improved. I'm sure if you speak to people in the villages, their lives are probably better because they no longer have to worry about leaving their house and getting hit in a strike or a landmine or whatever it may be, to the degree that they had to worry about that previously. And obviously you still have pockets of ISIS that are causing problems, but the actual war itself that was being waged there for 20 years isn't really a thing anymore. So there is that aspect of it.
We know there was a high, I don't even know if I can say high value. It was one of the most wanted men in the world for the United States government, an Al-Qaeda leader that was just targeted in Kabul. Have you heard anything more about Al-Qaeda? You mentioned ISIS, but is there any talk, even again, amongst your contacts, about the behavior or actions of Al-Qaeda? Because again, I don't want to forget that was the reason that we first went into Afghanistan.
Totally. And I did look into this a lot when I was there, and it was fairly apparent to me, and you could argue interpretations of this either way, in terms of the Doha Agreement, which was that the Taliban, in exchange for the US leaving, they were not to, harbor any groups that would plot attacks against the United States or its allies. So, depending on how you look at that, and from an interpretation point of view, we can look at it as, say, any Al-Qaeda presence is a threat to that. Or you could look at it as, and this was how the Taliban justified it to me, was that, yes, we're aware that there are people that are loyal to Al-Qaeda, they're still in the country, but they've been told that they cannot do any military action or do anything that's out of, they basically have to stay in their home and do nothing. And if we find out that they're doing anything, then we will go after them and punish them. So that was the way that I guess they viewed the agreement, which may be very different to the way that US lawmakers and the public views the wording on that agreement. So to me, it was quite apparent that Al-Qaeda, it had a footprint there, but it wasn't necessarily apparent to me that they were active in any way. I certainly think with Zawahiri being such a wanted man, and he, totally fair game on his part, and a really big error, really, especially of the Taliban and Siraj Haqqani, to allow him back. They can say that they weren't aware. Of course, we can hear all that, but I'm pretty sure that they would have been aware he was traveling back. He had to get through checkpoints and things. And so whilst Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan may not necessarily be especially active, Al-Qaeda around the world is hugely active. I mean, you look at parts of Africa where it's just groups that are aligned to Al-Qaeda commit horrific atrocities every day. So Zawahiri was the leader of not just Afghanistan, but of Al-Qaeda around the world. And I think looking at it from that point of view, it certainly makes him fair game for, to be targeted. So I think that was just a big lapse in judgment of the Taliban to sort of allow him to go back. His family, I believe, had relocated to Kabul at some point during this year, and he'd gone to join them a few years earlier, and obviously was being tracked by the United States. And
it makes me want to go back and review and read more carefully in the days that following that drone strike in Kabul. What's been said about U.S. intelligence gathering. Just curious about. There's been all these questions about how the Taliban. I'm not suggesting the Taliban gave up his location. I'm just asking the question though about, well, where did the intel come from? We don't have what is our footprint like in Afghanistan? You're never going to find that out on the record, by the way.
Yeah,
I
but mean, there's also reports, rumors, that the U.S. to some degree was still working with the Taliban to beat out ISIS positions. So the U.S. to some degree, had those capabilities already in place if that's something that they were there to do. And I also think it's really important to remind people that the goal of the U.S. in Afghanistan was never about rooting out the Taliban necessarily once they were removed from power. And obviously in the initial invasion, that was the goal, to get to usurp the Taliban from the position of running the country. But the goal was never necessarily to target the Taliban. So the goal from the very beginning was to target Al-Qaeda. And then that later morphed around 2014 into targeting ISIS. The goal was never, and that was a huge source of frustration for Afghans, because they were like, the ISIS is such a small, there's at its peak, maybe 1,000 ISIS members, and yet here's the Taliban, which is tens of thousands, and they're committing way more attacks against the civilian population and causing a lot more terror than ISIS is. But yet, the United States' mandate and the mission at that point was really going after just the ISIS elements, Al-Qaeda into ISIS. So that was very frustrating for the Afghans. And it really wasn't, I think, until Trump came to office in 2016 and he gave General Mattis at that point the authorization to go after Taliban targets. But for the vast majority, 16 years of the war, the Taliban was not the US's goal, and the Taliban was never a designated terrorist organization. And that was for many reasons, but I think to keep the dialogue open, which we saw in Doha. You had elements of it like the Haqqani network and other kind of offshoots that were designated terrorists, but the Taliban was never. And so I think, that is sort of lost a little bit in the shuffle of Afghan war politics.
Absolutely. And definitely will be an ongoing conversation about what is the relationship between the United States and the Taliban look like. What does recognition look like by the international community, if at all? And we're still there's still a lot of consternation about those questions, even now a year into Taliban rule. I have two final questions for you from our audience. Both Mary and Kelly were asking about girls and the future for women and girls in the country. What do you think is important to share about that?
I think it's incredibly difficult, for girls and women to in the large part not be able to access education and opportunities, and that's sort of, to me, that was one of the slithers of victory out of the 20-year occupation that really has evaporated under the Taliban rule. And granted, that's stems a lot from an adherence to Pashtun culture more so than it does to Islam. I mean, there are dozens of Muslim majority countries in the world and where education is very revered. You can, even a place like Saudi Arabia, which I've worked, women are all highly educated to different degrees. So I think this has got more to do with the Pashtun culture and the way that they kind of view the perception of women. And I think it's very unfortunate. Of course, the Taliban keeps saying, oh, but we've got to make sure the uniforms, we've got to make sure girls are separate. There's just sort of kind of one excuse after another. And there are a lot of elements within the Taliban itself that I might point out that I've spoken to that say, to me as a journalist, you need to keep pushing this because they also see the injustice of it. So Taliban isn't one entirely cohesive unit. And I think, that side of things definitely comes from the more Kandahari side of the sort of the Pashtun culture within the Taliban. So I do think it's really tough for women. Having said that, there are many resilient women. They still go out to the streets and risk getting beaten and arrested and all these things just to fight for their rights. And we could argue that that's completely ineffective, but I think from a symbolic point of view, that's important that they're still going out there, they're still facing the Taliban, and willing to stand up for what they believe in. There are also a lot of underground schooling networks that are still going. Women that I've spoken to still say that they do go to work. It's just that they are completely separate from the men. But then, of course, the overall economic situation means that there isn't the opportunity that was there. There isn't the healthcare, there isn't the finance. And as women, that one of the first things that really suffers is maternal health. And Afghanistan is a place where so many women, I believe at one point, under the previous rule, it was almost sort of 1 in 5 women would die in childbirth, and so many, such a huge percentage of, the babies wouldn't sort of make it past the age of 5. There was some progress with that over the past 20 years, but that to me is a cause for concern is seeing that kind of decline in the malnutrition and so many things that come up with it. So as much as women who are affected by the poverty and the economic crisis, they are also affected by war. I can't tell you how many. I remember going into an emergency hospital during the war in Afghanistan, and how many of these women were shot in the head or had stepped on a landmine, or so there's just it's. We always say women and children bear the brunt of war, and I certainly think in Afghanistan it's not new, and it's something that's been going on for a really long time, and I just hope that there is some sense of relief.
It's definitely a story that has a lot of attention on it. And there's that big question about, will the status of women be part of almost a negotiation piece for more broader engagement with the Taliban? So multiple reasons to watch it. And really one of the interviews we just did with Smarter News, that thought, which by the way, I didn't really think that, I haven't really reflected that much on over the last 2 decades, that the Taliban, there could be different opinions amongst the Taliban about education of women. I just thought, oh, no, they don't believe in it. Not realizing that there are some that say, no, actually, I would like my daughter to go to school. And just knowing that there's that diversity in the group, I think is really interesting. Mary's asking the number one question, which we'll end with here, Holly. Do you want to go back? When will you go back? What do you want to see?
Of course, I love Afghanistan. It's very deep into my heart. I'm planning hopefully to go back within the next. I've got a couple of other trips, so probably within the next month or 2. For me, being more of an investigative journalist, it was more important for me to have steps in place to do some more deep dives on different issues, as opposed to just being there for an anniversary, which to me at this point, it is what it is. But I'd sort of rather go back when there isn't a huge amount of packed journalism happening. I'm very interested in a lot of different aspects, whether it be, the state of terrorism in Afghanistan, how prevalent is ISIS, how prevalent is Al-Qaeda. There's also huge problems with the opioid trade. I think that really impacts Americans because you're looking at a place where 90% of the world's heroin comes out of Afghanistan, and obviously that costs a lot of lives here. And so I'm very interested in tracing some of those things and trying to kind of put a bigger picture on it, and I think just sort of deep dive into a lot of the issues that we aren't necessarily touching. China's rise in Afghanistan also, comes with a direct impact to the United States. So I think there are many things that need sort of a little bit more spotlighting.
Absolutely. Well, there's a lot of deep reflection at this period from last year, thinking back at not just today, but the weeks that followed. And we're going to kind of be following along with some of those really important moments on Smarter News. But I am going to try to reframe some of this in my mind, because I think I can say that we can make this date also an anniversary of our friendship, Holly, because it was that day that I said, wait, are you okay? Are you there? Do you want to do an Instagram live when the Taliban are taking over? I really feel like I found a friend, and also someone that I can share my passion about journalism with, and that is very rare. And it took an extraordinary event for our paths to cross. And I'm so grateful that they did. I'm grateful for Smarter News, the Smarter News audience, to also see all of your work. And I'm just grateful for your friendship overall, which has really bloomed over the last year. And we've been on many adventures, including to Ukraine. And I look forward to more adventures to come. So maybe next year we can do a proper reflection and also a celebration of a new chapter for Smarter News and for us.
Thank you so much for your support. Really, thank you to the Smarter News readers. I mean, that's one of the things that baffled me so much about, I'd be doing different for different places, but there was always something really special about Smarter News in the sense that I always felt that it was a very supportive, following, and there wasn't, so many people are always trying to cut you down or send really nasty things, and that was something I'd grown accustomed to. So the Smarter News was really different because I didn't experience any of that. Everybody asked informative questions and had a general the news that wasn't about adhering to a particular political agenda, but really trying to get to the bottom of something. So I think, you've built a really special audience, and I really appreciate your friendship and your support, and lots more to come.
Lots more to come. We're working on it. Hollie and I are working on it together. Don't you worry. And really, it's the community of people that make it. You could build something, but it's the people that come here. And you're right, all different backgrounds, so fascinating, and really help us propel the story forward and do the reporting we need to do. So Hollie, thank you. I appreciate it. I'll let you go. I tell Hollie always, oh, this will be short, and then we'll talk for an hour. And that's usually
we can talk for another probably 3 or 4 hours and still have not covered.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Hollie. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Jenna.
Bye now. I want to go ahead and show you guys, if I can. Hollie's going to jump off in just a second. And please make sure you follow along with Hollie McKay. You can follow her, Hollie S. McKay, on social media. She also has this incredible Substack where she does a lot of her reporting, which is always interesting. And by the way, I don't want to forget this. We'll mention this repeatedly over the next several weeks, but she has a brand new book coming out in Afghanistan that she did with her photographer, Jake, and images of this particular time period that they captured that are just unbelievable. So we have a lot to look forward to. I just want to leave you with this. I thought one of the interesting things I read today was about the celebrations by the Taliban in the street, celebrating what they're calling their day of independence from invasion. This is how they're framing this particular day. One of the things that they're talking about is a life free of corruption because of the corruption in the previous government, which unfortunately I should ask Hollie about that, because that was one of the really big highlights from how did this happen? How did the Taliban take over? In part because of a lot of corruption inside the U.S.-backed Afghan government and the key players there. And so a question about how you really weed out corruption is one that's difficult, not only in Afghanistan, but other places. This is the final image I want to show you. These are young boys in the street. I found it very interesting in a piece I read. The reporter was quoting a 22-year-old Taliban fighter about how he felt about the last year. And, just by simple math, he would have just been born when 9/11 happened. And so some of you asked about what about the next generation of Taliban fighters and of the Taliban. And this image of these young boys with the Taliban flag as part of the celebration gives us some ideas of why we have to pay attention to Afghanistan. There weren't a lot of people paying attention to Afghanistan broadly, generally speaking, before September 11th. And then, of course, that one event changed the course of so many lives, changed the course of American history forever, and changed the stories for so many Americans. So I want to not lose sight of this. And I think it's important to pay attention. So lots of thanks to Hollie for doing that with us. Thank you to as well for your support of Smarter News. We couldn't do this without you. It gives us purpose. And it is a pleasure and a privilege always to serve you on any of these big news stories. If you'd like more, I'm going to put more of Hollie's, this conversation along with several other really interesting interviews that we've already recorded We're going to put them up over the next several weeks, and I'm going to try to stack them on our website. So if you see one, then you'll see the others that kind of go along with it. And if this is a topic that interests you, I hope you'll find this helpful. In the meantime, thank you again for all your support, and more on smarternews.com. Have a great day.